This is the annual meeting of the National Committee on Alcoholism in the Hotel Statler, Pennsylvania, New York City, on March the 30th, Good Friday, 1956. The committee has held its three-day session, or is holding its three-day session. The first day was devoted to the homeless man. This is the second day, which is on the general subject of alcoholism. Right now, we are at the noon luncheon in the ballroom of the Hotel Statler, and we're about to hear Bill W., the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, give the main speech of the day. This is the 11th annual meeting of the National Committee. The background noise, the people who are just finishing their dessert. In just a moment, you will hear the proceedings of the meeting. This is a Cape Town 2 recording. I think probably Dr. Lovell and Mrs. Marty Mann will be the introducers of Bill W. One interesting note is that Val Dillon of Dursley, P.O. Box 8, Rhodesia, South Africa, arrived on the Pan American plane about midnight last night and is here. Also is Ian Cunningham. Both come from South Africa. Val Dillon was a very close friend of Marty Mann's when she was over there recently at the invitation of the Union of South Africa to discuss alcoholism throughout the Union. Also, incidentally, in this morning's New York Times, there was quite an article on Judge Murtaugh's talk yesterday on the subject of the effects upon New York City by the tearing down of the old dilapidated sections of the city and rebuilding them into new. This will mean that there will be a shift of the homeless man and the derelict from the old areas, and they will probably become a part of the newer areas in the city, and there will consequently be a new problem. In just a moment, the speeches will begin.
Ladies and gentlemen, go right ahead with your dessert. The waiters will not interrupt us. We have a short number of announcements and a little business to transact before the main speech of the luncheon. We have some honored guests with us on the dais. I'm going to introduce to you those who did not speak this morning and who will speak this afternoon and this noon. Those, as I call the names of these honored guests will rise so you can all see them, please. Honorable Angela Parisi, Chairman of the Workmen's Compensation Board, the State of New York, representing Governor Herron. Angela Parisi. Mr. Sidney Tartikoff, representing the Honorable Jacob Javits, Attorney General of New York, and also the National Association of Attorney Generals of the United States of America. Mrs. Anna Arnold Hedgeman, the Assistant to Mayor Robert F. Wagner of the City of New York. Mrs. Hedgeman. Dr. Harry V. McNeil, Consultant in Clinical Psychology in the Departmental Regional Office of the United States Department of Health, Education and Welfare, representing Dr. Leonard A. Shealy, Surgeon General of the United States. Dr. McNeil. We have a number of extremely interesting telegrams. I want to read a few of them to you. Here is one from the Honorable J. Percy Priest, Chairman of the House Committee on Interstate and Foreign Commerce. I regret very much that circumstances prevented me from accepting your invitation to be present for your luncheon today. I'm greatly interested in your program and wish you the maximum of success. The Honorable J. Percy Priest. Another, deepest regrets must miss annual meeting in this year of phenomenal progress. Warm regards to all my friends on committee and staff, and to Bill W. Good news from California that Alcoholic Rehabilitation Commission will probably get appropriation big enough to start 7 clinics plus substantial research in public education. Austin McCormick. Would that we in New York could do so well. Greetings and good wishes to the newest member of the National Health Council for a successful 11th annual meeting. May it appreciably advance your program, which is of grave importance to the total health improvement effort in the nation. Dr. Leona Baumgartner, President of the National Health Council. Holy Week duties prevent presence. Greetings from Southern Nevada Committee to annual meeting. Best thoughts. Reverend Wells Miller, the Executive Secretary. Dr. Gerald Dorman.
Dr. Lovett, ladies and gentlemen, I want to bring you the greetings of perhaps a little older organization, as long as we are celebrating 150 years of continuous service to the public this year. We are having our anniversary dinner on the 5th of April. When this organization was founded in 1806, the problems that we were facing were the acute diseases. We had a lot of cholera here in the city. One of the worst epidemics was shortly after we were founded in 1823. The last case disappeared shortly after 1900. We had typhoid fever. We had the diseases of infancy, so that your life expectancy was only about 30. Now your life expectancy has moved up close to 80. The result is that many of the problems with which we were faced when we were first organized have now been beaten. We now have the problems of old age. We have the problems of heart disease, of arteriosclerosis, of cancer, and we also have the problem of alcoholism. Because if we're getting into the age of atomic medicine, and I don't necessarily mean civil defense where an atom bomb, we hope, doesn't hit over New York City, but we already have the atomic submarine. We are shortly going to have atomic energy in industrial use for developing electric current for use in industrial enterprises. That means that the doctors are going to have to be able to warn against and recognizes the hazards that we get in industrial medicine. We are getting into space medicine because we already are being faced with higher and more rapid means of transportation through the air. And it is going to be very shortly that we have a world satellite. Now, we can't claim, as one of the problems of medicine, how to get the body back once you get them out in a world satellite. That is an engineering problem, and I don't mean to answer it at the present time. But it does indicate that there are large fields in which we still have to go forward in medicine. And with that, and with the realization that alcoholism is one of the problems that we find not only in medicine, but in business, I want to bring you the greetings of the County Society. Thank you very much.
We have with us a dynamic vice president of our organization and a hard-hitting chairman of our campaign committee who has a very important message to bring to us, Colonel Harold Riegelman.
Mr. President, friends, Mr. Smithers started off his report with a story that was really a sermon, a very pungent one, the more so because of its brevity. I'd like to supplement his report by telling a short story. This is not a story of an alcoholic. This is a story of a 10-year-old lad who's a real, unadulterated brat. Unhappily, his father died, and his mother, in due course, remarried. The usual inquisitive neighbor stopped him on the street one day. He said, "Tommy, how are you getting on with your new papa?" Tommy says, "I'm getting along all right. He's learning me how to swim." "Learning you how to swim? How does he do that?" "Well, he takes me 12 miles out to sea and throws me overboard, and I got to swim ashore." Well, the neighbor said, "Do you find that difficult?" Tommy says, "No, not too difficult. Not after I get out of the bag." Well, the bearing of this...
Thank you very much, Colonel Riegelman. I hope you all will take most seriously what the Colonel has just invited us to do. I have an announcement here. Mrs. Langdon has a slim gold pencil, a very beautiful one. She said it was so... I would like to, on the part of the board and on my own behalf, to thank particularly the volunteers for the main part of our meeting this noon. It fills me with emotion that I have been selected as the one who has these two people together in a public meeting place to give us a most wonderful message. These are not the sweethearts of Sigma Chi, but they are the sweethearts of all of us who have had an alcohol problem or who are deeply interested in trying to solve it. If it were not for these two people, I firmly believe that our knowledge of and our ability to help alcoholics would be back in the dark ages where it was only 25 years ago. These people, I'm sure, are well known to all of you and need no introduction. I am going to give you, therefore, our own executive director, who will introduce Bill W. Marty Mann.
Mr. President, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I had to have that formal beginning to find out if I had a voice. This moment is of such import to me that I have been fearful for a week I wouldn't be able to speak. It's a moment I've been waiting for a long time. The National Committee on Alcoholism was founded on a proof. Unless there had been proof that alcoholics could recover, there could have been no National Committee on Alcoholism. That proof was available by 1944, the year of the founding of the National Committee, because of what Alcoholics Anonymous had been doing for 9 years. And the work that Alcoholics Anonymous had been doing for 9 years is very largely due to a recovery of an individual. Everything has to start somewhere. We may want to look upon it as a divine plan. I think we should. But divine plans require instruments. Instruments that we can see and touch and hear that can reach us. Such an instrument was found in a man who had suffered deeply and terribly from alcoholism. And he was able to recover. And he discovered that in order to keep his recovery, he had to share it. He had to pass it on. I like to describe this as a discovery of a constructive chain reaction. Something was set in motion back in November 1934 that was to become one of the great forces for good of our time. I was very fortunate in coming in contact with this force when I most desperately needed it. It wasn't easy for me to change the pattern of my living from a negative one to a constructive one. And I had a little difficulty here and there in the beginning attempting my new life. The most serious difficulty I had was met by this same man who sought me out, dug me out, and whom I couldn't refuse to see. And when he spoke to me, he said something that I will never forget. Something that is having its culmination today. He asked me if I wanted to stop drinking. I said yes. He put his arms around me and he said, "I'm glad, because we have a long way to go together." Neither of us knew back in 1939 how far that road led or where it was going to lead, but we're still traveling that road together, and it's led up all the way, up and on. I believe that the contribution that was made through this instrument, if you like, is a contribution past description, past telling. I believe that it was largely through that contribution which produced living proof that we have been able to arrive at a meeting such as today, where we could bring together representatives of all the professional disciplines who are happily and gladly working in this field. This wasn't true 15 years ago. But we are able to get great names in medicine and psychiatry and social work and psychology and in public health to be present at a meeting like this, to take part in what we are doing, to join hands with that little band of recovered alcoholics to help lick this problem whole. Alcoholics couldn't do it alone. We wouldn't expect any other victims of a particular affliction to carry the whole burden of doing something about that particular disease, and we shouldn't expect it in this field. To lick a problem as complex, as vast, and as devastating as alcoholism requires the cooperation of every one of us, of every area of our life. To have that cooperation, we had to have evidence that it could produce something. That evidence exists in the growing ranks of Alcoholics Anonymous. And that proof exists because back in 1934, one man got sober and stayed sober and allowed himself to be used as the great instrument in spreading this word of hope. In my book, he is one of the greatest men of our time. I give you my friend, my sponsor, the reason why I'm here, Bill.
Well, folks, our world is certainly a world of contrasts. It was only a few years ago that the Westbrook Pegler wrote a piece in which he described Dr. Bob and me as the wet-brained founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. But very seriously, very happily, too, I think the AA is present in and out of this committee and everywhere, joining with Lois and me, are able to say that this is one of the finest hours that has yet come to us. Some people say that destiny is a series of events held together by a thin thread of chance or circumstance. Other people say that destiny is composed of a series of events strung on a cord of cause and effect. And still others say that the destiny of good works is often the issue of the will of God, and that He forges the links and brings the events to pass. I've been asked to come here to tell the story of AA, and in that story, everyone here, I'm sure, can find justification for either of those points of view. But I want to tell more than the story of AA this time. I was beset, I must confess, by a certain reluctance. And the reluctance issues out of this fact. Of course, everybody is fairly familiar with the fact that I once suffered alcoholism. But people are not so wise to the fact that I suffer also from schizophrenia, split personality. I have a personality, say, as a patriarch of AA, floundering father, if you like. I also have a personality as an AA member. And between these personalities is a terrific gulf. You see, a founding father of AA has to stand up for the AA tradition, which says you mustn't endorse anything or anybody, or even say good things about your friends on the outside, or even a Beeman's chewing gum, lest it be an endorsement. So, as a father of AA, I'm very strictly bound to do nothing but tell the story of our society. But as an AA member, like all the rest, I am an anarchist who revels in liberty. So I am really going to say this time what I damn please, if you will. If only you will receive me as Mr. Anonymous, one of the poor old drunks still trying to get on. Now to our narrative, and to the first link in the chain of events that has led up to this magnificent hour. I was by no means the first link in this chain, and only one of very many. I think the founder business ought to be well deflated, and I'm just going to take a minute or two to do it. As a fact, the first chain, or the first link in the chain, was probably forged about 25 years ago in the office of a great psychiatrist, Carl Jung. At that time, he had as a patient a certain very prominent American businessman. They worked together for a year. My business friend Roland was a very grim case of alcoholism. And yet, under the doctor's guidance, he felt he was going to find relief. He left the doctor in great confidence. Shortly, he was back drunk. And said he to Dr. Jung, "Well, what now? You're my court of last resort." And the doctor looked at him and said, "I thought you might be one of those rare cases that could be touched with my art, but you aren't. I have never seen," continued Dr. Jung, "one single case of alcoholism recover so grave as yours under my tutelage." Well, to my friend Roland, this was tantamount to a sentence of death. "But, doctor," said he, "is there no other recourse? Nothing else?" "Yes," said Dr. Jung, "there is something else. There is such a thing as a transforming spiritual experience." Well, Roland beamed. "After all, I've been a vestryman in the Episcopal Church. I'm a man of faith." "Oh," Dr. Jung said, "that's fine so far as it goes, but it has to go a lot deeper than that. I'm speaking of transforming spiritual experiences. Where would I find such a thing?" said Roland. Dr. Jung said, "I don't know. The lightning strikes here, it strikes there, it strikes in the other place. We don't know how or what. You will just have to expose yourself in the religion of your own choice, or to spiritual influence as best as you can, and just try and ask, and maybe it will be open." So my friend Roland joined up with the Oxford groups, the sometime Bookmanites of that day, at first in London, then came to New York, and lo and behold, the lightning did strike. He found himself unaccountably released of his obsession to drink. After a time, he heard of a friend of mine, a chap we call in A.A. Abbey, who sojourned every summer in Vermont, an awful grim case. He had just driven his father's bright, shiny new Packard into the side of someone's house, had bashed into the kitchen, pushed aside the stove, and had said to the startled lady there, "How about a cup of coffee?" The neighbors thought this was enough. They figured he ought to be locked up. He was taken before Judge Graves in Bennington, Vermont, a place not too far from my home, by the way. And there, our friend Roland heard of him, and gathering a couple of Oxford groupers together, one of them an alcoholic, the other just a two-fisted drinker, they took Abbey in tow. And they inoculated him with these very simple ideas. That he, Abbey, could not do this job on his own resources. He had to have help. That he might try the idea of getting honest with himself as he had never been before. He might try the idea of making a confession of his defects to someone. He might try the idea of making restitution for harms done. he might try the idea of giving of himself to others, no price tag on it. Agnostic he was, but yet he might try the idea of praying to whatever God there was. That was the essence of what my friend Ebbe abstracted from the Oxford groups of that day. True, we later rejected very much of other things they had to teach and say. True, these principles might have been found somewhere else, but as it happens, they were found there. And Ebbe, for a time, got this same phenomena of release. He remembered me. He was brought to New York, lodged in Calvary Mission, soon called me up where I lay home drinking at Brooklyn. I never will forget the day. Suddenly he stood in the areaway. I hadn't seen him for a long time. By this time I knew something of the gravity of my plight. I couldn't put my finger on him, but he seemed strangely changed. Besides, he was sober. He came in, began to talk. I offered him some grog. Remember, I had a big pitcher of gin and pineapple juice there. Pineapple juice to make Lois think it wasn't straight yet. No, he didn't care for a drink. Was he on the wagon? Well, no, not exactly. Well, what's got into you? Well, said he, I've got religion. Well, that was rough on me. He'd got religion. Substituted religious insanity for alcoholic insanity, no doubt. Well, I had to be polite. I said, well, what brand is it? And he said, well, I wouldn't exactly call it a brand. I've run across a group of people over here who have sold me on getting honest with myself, have sold me on the idea that I'm powerless over my problems, have taught me to help others. I'm trying to bring something to you if you want it, etc. So in his turn, he transmitted to me these simple ideas across the kitchen table. Meanwhile, another chain of events had been taking shape. In fact, the earliest link in that chain perhaps runs back to William James, sometimes called the father of modern psychology. And another link in that chain was my own doctor, William Duncan Silkworth, who I think will someday be accounted a medical saint. I'd had the usual struggle with this problem. Had met Dr. Silkworth at Towns Hospital. He had explained in very simple terms what it was: an obsession that condemned me to drink against my will, an increasing physical sensitivity which guaranteed that I would die or go mad unless I could somehow find relief, perhaps through re-education. He taught me the nature of this malady. But here I was, again flat, still at it. Now then, here is my friend talking to me over a kitchen table. And already, you see, the elements that lie today in the foundation of AA were already present. The God of science in the person of Dr. Silkworth and in the person of Dr. Carl Jung had said no. As a matter of psychology, psychiatry, or medicine, that can't do it alone. Your willpower can't do it alone. So the rug had been pulled out from under Hazard, and Hazard, another alcoholic, had pulled the rug out from under Ebbe, and now he was pulling it out from under me, quoting Dr. Jung and substantiating what Dr. Silkworth had let leak back to me through Lois. So the stage was really set. And it had been some years in the setting before it ever caught up with me. Of course, I balked at this idea of a power greater than myself. The rest of the program seemed sensible enough. I was desperate, about ready to try anything. but I still did gag on the God business. But at length I said to myself, as every AA member since had, who am I to say there is no God? Who am I to say how I am to get well? Like a cancer patient, I'm not ready to do anything, to be dependent on any kind of a physician. And if there is a great physician, I had better seek him out. So pretty drunk, I went back to Towns Hospital, was put to bed. 3 days later, my friend appears again. One alcoholic talking to another across that strange, powerful bond that we can effect with each other. In his one hand, and in the hands of the doctor, hopelessness. On the other side, hope. So he went through his little list of principles. Getting honest, making restitution, working with other people, praying to whatever God there was, and he left. And when he had gone, I sunk into a terrific depression, the like of which I have never known. And I suppose for a moment the last vestiges of my prideful obstinacy were crushed out at great depth. And I cried out like a child, now I'll do anything to get well. And then with no faith, almost no hope, I again cried, if there is a God, will he show himself? Immediately the place lit up in a great light. It seemed to me that I was on a mountaintop. There was a sudden realization that I was free, utterly free of this thing. And as the ecstasy subsided, I'm again on the bed, and now I'm surrounded by a sense of presence and a mighty assurance, and a feeling that no matter how wrong things were, ultimately all would be well. And I thought to myself, so this is the God of the preacher. From that day to this, I've scarcely been tempted to drink. So instantaneous and terrific was the release from obsession. At about that time of my stay in the hospital and after the experience, somebody handed me a copy of William James on varieties of religious experience. Many of us, of course, profoundly disagree with James's pragmatic philosophy, but I think that nearly all will agree that this is a great text, The Varieties of Religious Experience, in which he examines these mechanisms. And in that book of his, great numbers, the great majority of these experiences, took off from a base of utter hopelessness. In some controlling area of the individual's life, he had struck a wall, couldn't get under, around, or over. That kind of hopelessness was the forerunner of the transforming experience. And as I began to read, those common denominators just stuck out of the cases cited by James. And I began to wonder, yes, I fitted into that pattern, but why hadn't more alcoholics fitted into it before now? In other words, what we needed was more deflation at depth to lay hold of this transforming experience. Then comes Dr. Silkworth with those two little words, the obsession and the allergy. Not such little words, big words, twin ogres of madness and death, with science pronouncing its verdict of hopelessness, so far as our own resources were concerned. Ah, yes, I'd had that dose. That had perhaps laid the ground. One alcoholic talking to another had convinced where no others had brought me any conviction. So I began to race madly around, trying to help alcoholics. In gratitude, joined briefly the Oxford group, but they were more interested in saving the world then than alcoholics. That didn't last too long. And I began to tell people of this sudden mystic experience, and I fear I was preaching a great deal. And not one single drunk sobered up for a whole 6 months. Again comes the man of medicine, Dr. Silkworth, and he said, Bill, haven't you got the cart before the horse? Why don't you stop talking about this queer experience of yours and all of this morality, and why don't you pour it into them, how medically sick these people are, and then maybe coming from you, over the identification you can get with those other fellas, then maybe you'll soften them up so they'll buy this moral psychology. At about that time, I'd been urged to get back into business and quit being a missionary. Did hook onto a small business deal which took me to Akron, Ohio. The deal fell through, and for the first time I felt tempted to drink. I was left in a hotel with about $10 in my pocket. My newfound friends had disappeared, and I thought to myself, gee, you'd better look up another alcoholic to work with. And then I realized as never before how working with other alcoholics had played such a great part in sustaining my original experience. Well, again, friends came to the rescue. I went down to the lobby, looked at the church directory, absent-mindedly drew my finger down a list of names. There appeared rather an odd one, the Reverend Tonks. I said, well, I'll call up Tonks. Turned out to be a wonderful Episcopal clergyman. I said I was a drunk looking for another drunk to work on, tried to explain why. The good man showed some alarm. After all, nevertheless, he gave me a list of about 10 names, some of them Oxford groupies. I called all those people up. Well, Sunday was coming. Maybe they'd see me in church. Some are going out of town. I exhausted the list, all but one. And none had found time nor cared enough. Something not very strange in the circumstances. And I went down and took another look in the bar. And something said to me, you'd better call her up. The name was Henrietta Cyberling. I took her to be the wife of a tire tycoon out there that I'd once met, and I said, well, this lady on a Saturday afternoon certainly won't want to see me. But I called her, and she said, come right out. I'm not an alcoholic, but I think I understand. This led to the meeting with Dr. Bob, one of my many co-partners in this enterprise. And as Dr. Silkworth had suggested, I poured it into him, how sick we were. And that produced his immediate recovery. I went to live in his house. Presently, Bob said, hadn't we better be working on alcoholics? I said, sure, I think we have. He found an opportunity at the City Hospital in Akron. One was being brought in at the moment in DTs on a stretcher. Drunk 6 times in 4 months, couldn't even get home without getting stewed. That was to be AA number 3, the first man on the bed. Dr. Bob and I went to see him. He said, but no, I'm too far gone. Besides, I'm a man of faith. Nevertheless, we poured it into him. The medical hopelessness of this thing, so far as one's own resources were concerned. What had happened to us, we made clear. And the next morning we came, and he was saying to his wife, give me my clothes, we're going to get up and get out of here. Yes, these are the men. They are the ones that understand. Right then and there was formed the first AA group in the summer of 1935. The synthesis in its main outlines was complete. But Lord, we hadn't even started. The struggles of those next few years, a wonderful thing to think about. Terribly slow, this one. We got way into 1939 before we produced even 100 recoveries in Akron and in New York, a few at Cleveland, Ohio. Then in that year, the Cleveland Plain Dealer ran pieces about it, of such strength that the few AAs in Cleveland were flooded with hundreds of cases. And that added one more needed ingredient. Up to this time, it had been deadly slow. Could this thing spread? Could we get into mass production? And in a matter of months, 20 Clevelanders had sobered up several hundred newcomers. But that required hospitalization, and we weren't liked in the hospital. Meanwhile, and now I come to the subject of this committee and its relation with AA and the linkage between them. Meanwhile, great events were going on down here. There had been in preparation a book to be called Alcoholics Anonymous. As a precaution, we'd made a mimeographed copy to be passed around. One of these copies was sent to a man who I consider to be one of the greatest friends that this society can ever have. Dr. Harry Thibault, one-time chairman of this committee. Harry Thibault is the man who got me before the medical societies when that took great courage. Well, I'm getting ahead of my story. Harry gets one of these mimeographed copies of the AA book. He hands it to a certain patient at Blythewood in Greenwich. The patient was a lady. She read the book. It made her very mad. She threw it out the window. And she got drunk. That was the first impact of Alcoholics Anonymous. Harry got her sobered up, handed her the book again, and a phrase caught her eye, the one that triggered it. We cannot live with resentment, the book said. This time she didn't throw it out the window. Presently she came to our little meeting. You must remember we were still less than 100 strong. In the early part of 1939 over in our Brooklyn house, 182 Clinton Street. And she came back from that parlor to Greenwich and made a remark that is today a classic in AA. She said to a fellow patient and sufferer and friend there in the sanitarium, "Granny, we're not alone anymore. This is it." Well, that was the beginning for Mark. Much help by Harry, Mrs. Wiley, proprietor of the place, Marty started the first group on the grounds in Greenwich on the grounds of the sanitarium. She began frantically working, became the dean of our women workers. So our society had made two terrific friends, Dr. Harry and Mark. And this would be in 1939. Now then, in the intervening years, up to 1944, AA itself was in a vast turmoil. The Saturday Post piece had been published, which caused 6,000 frantic inquiries to hit our post office box here in New York from all over the country, indeed all over the world. So then the great question was posed, could AA spread? Could it function? Could it hang together with this enormous, neurotic, explosive content that we had? We just didn't know. But, again, it was do or die. In old Ben Franklin's words, we'd either hang together or mighty well hang separate. And out of this group experience, there began to evolve traditions. Traditions that had to do with AA's unity and function and relation with the world outside, and our relation to such things as money, property, prestige, all that sort of thing. The tradition of Alcoholics Anonymous, with which you folks for the most part, are familiar. Those principles began to take shape, began to gather force, and little by little, order began to come out of this seething mass of drunks in their quest for sobriety. By now, the membership of the movement had run up into the many thousands, and as Marty observed, there was now proof that it could be done. But we were still a long way from today. AA still needed friends. Friends of medicine, friends of religion, friends of the press. We'd had a handful, but we needed a lot of friends. The public needed to know what sort of malady this was, that something could be done about it. So that this committee, much like Alcoholics Anonymous, is notable not only for what it has done in its own sphere, but for what it has set in motion. I remember very well when this committee started. It brought me in contact with our great friends at Yale, the courageous Dr. Haggard, the incredible Dr. Jelinek, or Bunky as we affectionately know him, with Selden, and all those dedicated people. And the question arose, well, could an AA member get into education or research or whatnot? And then ensued a fresh great controversy in AA. Not surprising, because you must remember in that period, we were like the people on Rickenbacker's raft. Who would dare to rock that ever so little and precipitate us all back into the alcohol sea? So we were frankly afraid. And as usual, we had the radicals and we had conservatives and we had moderates on this question of whether AA members could go into other enterprises in this field. And the conservatives said, no, let's keep it simple. Let's mind our own business. And the radicals said, let us endorse anything that looks like it will do any good. Let the AA name be used to raise money, to do all that it can do for the whole field. And the growing body of moderates took the position, let any AA member who feels the call go into these related fields. For if we are to do less, that is a very antisocial outlook. So that is where the tradition finally fell. And many were called, and many were chosen since that day to go in to these related fields, which have now got to be so large in their promise that we of Alcoholics Anonymous are getting down to our right sound and we are now realizing that we are only a small part of a great big picture. We are realizing again, afresh, that without our friends, not only could we have not existed in the first place, but we could have not have grown. We are getting a fresh concept in AA of what our relation with the world should be, and with all of these related enterprises. In other words, we are growing up. In fact, last year in St. Louis, we made bold to say that we had come of age, and that within Alcoholics Anonymous, the main outlines of the basis of recovery, of the basis for unity, and of the basis for service or function were already evident. And at St. Louis, I made talks upon each of those subjects, which largely concerned themselves with what AA had done about these things. But here, we are in a much wider field. And I think the sky's the limit. And I think I can say without any reservation that what this committee has done, with the aid of its great friends, who are now legion, as anyone here can see, I think that this committee has been responsible for making more friends for Alcoholics Anonymous and of doing a wider service in educating the world on the gravity of this malady and what can be done about it than any other single agency. And I'm awfully partial, and maybe I'm a little biased, because here sits the dean of all our ladies, my close, dear, and beloved friend. So speaking out of turn as the founder, I want to convey to her in the presence of all of you the best I can say of my great love and affection and thanks. At the close of things in St. Louis, I remember that I likened AA to a cathedral-style edifice whose corners now rested across the earth. I remember saying that we can see on its great floor the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, and there assembled maybe 150,000 sufferers and their families. We had seen sidewalls going up, buttressed with the AA tradition. And at St. Louis, when the elected conference took over our board of trustees, the spire of a service was in effect, and its beacon light, the beacon light of AA, shone there, beckoning to all the world. But I realized as I sat here today that that wasn't a big enough concept. For on that floor of the Cathedral of the Spirit, there should always be written the formula from whatever source for release from alcoholism, whether it be a drug, whether it be the psychiatric art, whether it be the administration of this committee. In other words, we who deal with this problem are all in the same boat, all standing upon the same floor. So let's bring to that floor the total resources that can be brought to bear upon this problem. And let us not think of unity just in terms of the AA tradition. Let us think of unity among all those who work in the field as the kind of unity that befits brotherhood and sisterhood and a kinship and a common suffering. And let us stand together in the spirit of service. If we do these things, I think only then can we declare ourselves really come of age. And only then, and that is a time certainly not far off, I think we can say that our future, the future of this committee, of AA, of the things that people of goodwill are trying to do in this field, will be completely assured. Thank you.
This is March the 30th, 1956, in the Hotel Statler in New York City. And I'm sitting here while they're setting up the tables at the meeting of the annual meeting of the National Committee on Alcoholism. We're about to have the luncheon, and on the other side of this tape, you will hear Bill Wilson's address, Bill being the principal speaker today. The background noise are the waiters setting up the tables for the luncheon. I just met Val Dillon, who flew in and arrived about a little after midnight last night on Pan American from Joburg or Johannesburg, South Africa. He, I suppose, at this point is in quite a state of confusion. But here is Val Dillon from Dursley, P.O. Box 8, South Africa. Val, just talk. We were mentioning the fact that Pat O'Foley started the committee, Cape Peninsula Committee on Alcoholism down in Cape Town, and Val is saying that they're making progress in Joburg and just had a recent meeting. What was that meeting, Val?
Well, you see, what happened when Marty Mann came out about 5 years ago, we started up these committees all over the place. Unfortunately, in Johannesburg, everybody came in. Those who were interested in the alcoholic, those who were interested in alcohol, the lot. And nobody could get anywhere with such a mixed crowd.
Mm-hmm. Were they AAs or a mixture?
Oh,
non-alcoholics too?
Non-alcoholics. We had doctors, AAs, temperance, prohibitionists, the lot. And in Joburg, the only thing they could do was just about let it die completely. And then those who weren't really interested in the alcoholic himself all fell away. When they all fallen away, then they revived it and got going. As soon as they had got going, they convened this national conference on alcoholism. In the meanwhile, most of the committees in the country had died down. Some of them had died away completely, and some had died down and were more or less dormant. But the prospect of this conference coming off revived a lot of them. The only one who had really been active all the time had been Pat down at Cape Town, who had managed to talk people into providing sufficient funds to put up a full-time office with himself as a full-time secretary. Well, we had this meeting at the beginning of February.
What? Good. February this year?
Yes. I forget what the date was, but within the first 3 or 4 days of February, we all met in Joburg. We stayed out at the conference was held at the Witwatersrand University, which is in Johannesburg. The delegates all stayed in the university hostel, so that we were all together for the 3 days. We ate together, we slept together, we talked together, so we were all there, and there was a lot of discussions going on in between meetings, just as much discussion there as there was at the meeting itself. And the thing that amazed me was that there were about 30 delegates there. I've never seen 30 people with all of one mind. There's never any time was there an argument as to which road to take. The only argument was how to stay on the road we wanted to go on. And
just 1 second, Val. Among the 30, who were they in general? AAs, government officials? Was the Minister of Health there or represented?
No. The Minister of Health has, well, we've got another one since Marty was out there, but their opinion has always been that the government are not going to take an active part in promoting this thing. They wanted to see it going, a going concern, and then they would support it. But they weren't going to bring it into being themselves. They wanted to make sure there were sufficient people in the country interested enough to get the thing going itself. And so that there was no official government representative there at all. Of the 30, I would say 10 were medical men, 10 were AAs, and another 10 were just interested from the layman's point of view. Some of them were indirectly connected with AA, such as through family groups, something of that sort. Well, talking of the doctors, it was rather interesting to see at one stage there a serious discussion by all 10 the doctors as to how the doctors in general should be educated or could be educated as to the problem of alcoholism.
Was there much acceptance of disease or lack of acceptance to disease?
Oh, unanimous that it was a disease.
Good.
Amongst those present. First of all, the meeting, the conference took the form that the first session was a description by the various delegates of what was happening in their particular centers. In the afternoon of the first day was a discussion on the advisability of forming a national council, and that being decided, they discussed a constitution for this national council, which was passed. The proposed constitution had already been circulated. That was passed, and the national council came into being on the Saturday afternoon and held its first meeting there and then.
I read that the mayor of Johannesburg made quite a speech.
Yes, he was there to open the conference. It was quite a speech. He didn't really show very deep understanding of the whole problem, but whatever the problem was, he was sympathetic.
He gave it his blessing.
Yes.
Well, what are the future plans? Are they specific?
Yes. The immediate object is to set up an information office for the National Council and to assist individual local committees to set up information centers. They haven't got much further. I mean, questions of finance and so forth have all got to be solved first. We've got to get some money.
Well, then now it started on a usual pattern, but the creation of the information center in Johannesburg, yes?
Yes, well, Johannesburg has been chosen as the headquarters of the National Council, mainly because of the fact that if money for this question can be raised, it'll be easier to raise it in Johannesburg than anywhere else. We've got the mining companies, we've got the city council are very sympathetic. They're the headquarters of most of the organizations, ex-servicemen's organizations, Governor General's Fund, BESL, and so forth. They're all in Johannesburg.
Val, I read in one of the papers, I don't know whether it was Joburg or Cape Town, that two of the distilleries had to close down because the employees were drunk. This sounds like a spectacular news story, but do you have much of a drinking problem in South Africa?
Well, we had the government invited Dr. Mace, who's the marriage guidance expert, out to South Africa a little while ago. And he came out, spent considerable time in Johannesburg, investigated the causes of divorce and all the rest of it. And in a public speech, he reckoned that nowhere in the world has he seen such drinking as in Johannesburg. And he's been around.
Well, what is the reason? Is it a climate situation? Is it an ethnological situation? Is it the gold mines? Is it the loners? If there is a reason.
I don't know if there is a reason or not. I think we're just that way.
You just like your liquor.
Yeah. It's probably the gold mines have a lot to do with it. The miners, there's always a tough crowd wherever they are, and you'll find, at least everywhere I've been, wherever there are miners, there seems to be a hard drinking lot.
Val, we're going to close this because they're getting set up here now. We'll talk later on. I know that Dick Caron is going to have quite a schedule for you here in the eastern part of the United States, and you want to cover all of the states. So the next trip, as I put you on this recorder, I look forward to your being in Baltimore and Washington, and you're visiting the Department of Mines of the U.S. government. So thanks a million, Val. Talk to you later on, and it's wonderful to welcome you to the U.S. We have heard of your coming, and everyone looks forward to seeing you and and actually wondering what you're like. I must tell you one story while I'm right here. When I went out to the first convention in 1950 in Cleveland, there were several of the groups in South Africa that elected me to represent them because no one could come up on account of the cost. So I went out there, was recognized as representing South Africa at the convention. And you know, more of the girls used to come up to me. I wore a badge with Tom Burnett, South Africa, on it. More of the girls would come up to me and look at me and stare and say, gee whiz, you don't look like a South African. And now I can say the same thing of you from our U.S. point of view. Because we do think of the much publicized great area you park down there with the lions and the tigers and the rhinos, and we see so many of the tribal pictures and so on, that over a long period of time we've had some weird ideas in South Africa, but it's wonderful to have you here.
Well, except for the zoo, the nearest line to Johannesburg is about 200 miles away.
I don't doubt. Val, we'll get together later, and I'll see you in Baltimore.
Yes, right. Thanks, Tom.